the will reading for my late husband, I noticed something strange about the way his family was looking at me. Not with sympathy, not with respect, but with the quiet, satisfied smiles people wear when they believe someone else's life is about to collapse. I simply folded my hands in my lap and waited. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story, and if you'd like, tell me the city you're watching from. It still amazes me how far these stories travel. The lawyer cleared his throat and adjusted the stack of papers in front of him. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Across the polished mahogany table sat the people who had called themselves my family for nearly 40 years. My husband's son, Daniel, leaned back in his chair with an expression that hovered somewhere between boredom and anticipation. His wife, Margaret, sat beside him, her lips curved in a thin smile that never reached her eyes. Next to them were their 2 adult children, both scrolling on their phones as though this entire event was a minor inconvenience. None of them looked at me the way they had looked at my husband when he was alive. But then again, they never really had. My husband, General Robert Whitaker, had been a man whose presence filled a room before he even spoke. 6'2", broad shoulders, a voice that could quiet a crowded hall without ever rising above calm authority. For 35 years, he had served his country with honor. To the world, he was a decorated officer. To me, he was simply Robert, the man who had walked into a dusty orphanage more than 50 years ago and changed the entire course of my life. But that part of the story, the part his family liked to forget. The lawyer began reading. The estate of General Robert Whitaker will be distributed according to the following instructions. His voice was steady, measured, professional. Margaret crossed her legs and leaned closer to Daniel. I heard her whisper something under her breath. Something about how long this was going to take. Daniel chuckled softly. I kept my eyes on the table, because if I had looked up, I might have seen exactly what they expected to happen. And I wasn't ready for that yet. The conference room was large, the kind used by prestigious law firms to impress wealthy clients. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched along one wall, revealing the skyline of downtown Chicago. The afternoon sun filtered through the glass, casting long shadows across the polished table. At the far end sat Mr. Caldwell, the attorney who had handled my husband's affairs for more than 20 years. He had attended the funeral 3 days earlier. He had shaken my hand gently and said very little. But there had been something in his eyes then, something thoughtful, almost cautious. Now he flipped to the next page. My client has directed that certain personal items be distributed first. Daniel straightened slightly. Margaret's smile widened. I knew what they were waiting for. The house. The investments. The land in Montana. They had spent the entire week speaking about it as if the outcome were already decided. As if the life I had lived with Robert for nearly 4 decades had somehow been invisible. Margaret had even said it openly the night after the funeral. We were still standing in the living room of the house Robert and I had shared for 37 years. The smell of lilies from the funeral arrangements filled the air. She had walked slowly around the room, examining the furniture like a realtor assessing property. Well, she had said casually, this place is going to need a full renovation. I remember blinking in confusion. Daniel had nodded. Dad always said the market here was strong. We could probably sell it for close to $3 million. I had been standing right there. In the house. In the room where Robert and I had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, quiet Sunday mornings with coffee. Margaret had finally looked at me. Not unkindly, but not kindly either. Just practically. You'll probably want to start looking for somewhere smaller, she said. Something easier to manage. Daniel added, almost as an afterthought, a condo maybe. Neither of them had asked what Robert wanted. Neither of them had asked what I wanted. Because in their minds I had never truly belonged there. To them, I was simply the girl their father had taken in out of charity. The orphan. The outsider. The woman who somehow stayed. And when Robert died, they believed the charity had ended. Back in the conference room, Mr. Caldwell continued reading. Several items were distributed to charities Robert had supported. A military scholarship fund. A veterans rehabilitation center. A small museum dedicated to the history of the 5th Infantry Division. Daniel shifted impatiently. Margaret checked her watch. Finally Daniel spoke. Is there a section about the house? The lawyer paused briefly. There is. Margaret leaned forward. I could feel the air in the room tighten. Daniel glanced toward me then for the first time since we sat down. And there it was. That same expression again. The one they had worn all morning. A mixture of amusement and expectation. Margaret gave a soft laugh. Honestly, she said quietly, though loud enough for everyone to hear. I just hope this doesn't take all afternoon. Some of us have lives to get back to. Daniel smirked. Then Margaret's eyes moved toward me. Slowly. Deliberately. Well, she added with a small shrug. I suppose some people are about to have a lot more free time than they expected. Daniel chuckled under his breath. One of the grandchildren looked up from his phone. Wait, he said casually. Does that mean she has to move out? Margaret didn't answer immediately. She simply tilted her head toward me and smiled. A thin, polite smile that felt colder than any insult. Well, she said. I guess we'll find out soon enough. I didn't respond. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. Instead, I did the same thing I had done for nearly 40 years whenever Robert's family looked at me like that. I stayed quiet. Because Robert had always told me something very simple. Patience reveals the truth of people. Across the table, Mr. Caldwell turned another page. Then he looked up slowly. And for the first time since the reading began, his eyes met mine. There was something different in his expression now. Something careful. Something deliberate. He adjusted his glasses and spoke again. Before we continue with the remaining assets, he said calmly, there is one final section my client insisted be read aloud in full. The room grew completely still. Margaret frowned slightly. Daniel leaned forward. And for the first time that morning, the quiet confidence in their faces began to shift. The room stayed silent after Mr. Caldwell mentioned the final section. Margaret leaned back in her chair with a small sigh, as if this entire process were taking far longer than it deserved. Daniel drummed his fingers against the polished table. One of the grandchildren whispered something to the other, and they both chuckled quietly. No one looked worried. Not yet. Mr. Caldwell adjusted the papers in front of him, but instead of reading immediately, he paused for a moment. His eyes moved briefly around the room. Then they settled on me again. There was something thoughtful in that look. Almost respectful. I lowered my gaze back to my folded hands. My fingers rested calmly against the cool surface of the table. But inside my mind, memories had already begun to move. Memories that stretched far beyond this quiet conference room in downtown Chicago. Far beyond the whispers and the smirks sitting across from me. They went back more than 50 years. Back to a place that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old floor wax. Back to the orphanage where my life had begun. The building itself had been large and gray, built sometime in the early 1900s. Tall narrow windows, long echoing hallways, and rows of metal beds lined up like soldiers in a barracks. I was 8 years old when I first saw Robert Whittaker. Though back then he wasn't General Whittaker to the world. To me, he was simply a tall man in a dark military coat, who looked completely out of place in a room full of children. I remember the sound of his boots on the wooden floor. Slow, steady, measured. The matron had lined us up that afternoon. 20 children standing shoulder to shoulder. All of us freshly washed. Hair combed. Hands folded. We were used to visitors. Sometimes couples came hoping to adopt a baby. Sometimes church groups arrived with boxes of toys during the holidays. But a man in uniform alone was something different. He walked slowly down the line of children, speaking quietly with the matron. I didn't hear most of the conversation, but I remember the moment his eyes stopped on me. I had been the smallest girl in the row. Thin arms, worn shoes that were slightly too big, and a stubborn habit of looking people directly in the eye. The matron leaned toward him and whispered something. I later learned what she had said. That one is trouble, she told him. Too quiet. Too independent. Robert had looked at me again. Then he smiled slightly. Not a big smile. Just the kind that softened the corners of his eyes. What's your name? He asked. Emily, I said. My voice had been small, but steady. He crouched slightly so his eyes were level with mine. Do you like books, Emily? I nodded. The truth was, books were the only place I ever felt like I belonged. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object. A silver coin. He placed it in my palm. "Keep that," he said. "Lucky coins should stay with people who look like they might need a little luck." I didn't know then that he had just buried his wife 3 months earlier, or that his own house had been unbearably quiet ever since, or that he had come to the orphanage that day simply because he couldn't stand the silence anymore. But something changed that afternoon. 2 weeks later, the matron called me into her office. Robert Whittaker was sitting in the chair beside her desk. The same uniform, the same calm expression. But this time there was a warmth in his eyes I hadn't noticed before. "Emily," the matron said, clearing her throat, "Mr. Whittaker would like to speak with you." Robert leaned forward slightly. "Would you like to come live with me?" For a moment the world seemed to stop. Children in the orphanage learn very quickly not to believe promises. Too many visitors make kind comments that meant nothing. Too many adults disappeared after a single afternoon. So I asked him the only question that mattered. "Why?" He studied my face for a long moment before answering. "Because every house should have laughter in it," he said quietly. "And I think mine has been too quiet for too long." The orphanage had never felt warm. But the house Robert brought me to did. It was a large brick home in a quiet neighborhood near the military base. The first night I slept there I woke up twice. Not because I was afraid, but because the bed was too soft, and the room was too quiet. Robert knocked gently on my door the next morning. "Breakfast is at 7, he said. "No one is required to talk before coffee." I didn't understand the joke then, but over time I learned many things about Robert Whittaker. He believed in discipline. He believed in honesty. And above all, he believed that family wasn't something you were born into. It was something you chose to build. For many years that belief shaped the life we shared. But there was one part of that life Robert could never fully control. His own family. Daniel had been 16 when I first moved into the house. Old enough to understand exactly what my arrival meant. And old enough to resent it. He never shouted. He never openly argued with his father. But from the very beginning he made one thing very clear. In his eyes I didn't belong there. Not in the house. Not in the family. And certainly not in the future they all believed would one day belong to them. Daniel never said the words directly. Not when my father, because that's what Robert had become to me, was standing in the room. But children have a way of showing what they think without needing to speak. And Daniel was very good at it. The first time I noticed it clearly was about 2 weeks after I moved into the house. Robert had already settled into his routine with quiet efficiency. Breakfast at 7. School by 8. Homework finished before dinner. And every Sunday afternoon without exception, we visited the small bookstore 2 blocks away. He said a house without books was like a body without bones. Daniel rarely joined us. At 16 he had other priorities. Friends. Parties. Football games. But when he was home the air in the house changed slightly. Not loudly. Just enough to feel it. One evening Robert was working late at the base. And it was just the 2 of us in the kitchen. I had just finished washing the dishes. Daniel walked in, opened the refrigerator, and stared inside like he was searching for something important. After a moment he closed the door and leaned against the counter. "You know this isn't permanent, right?" he said. His tone wasn't angry. If anything it sounded bored. I looked up from the dish towel in my hands. "What isn't?" "This," he said, gesturing vaguely around the kitchen. "The house. The whole situation." I didn't answer. He smirked slightly. "My dad likes helping people. That's kind of his thing." Then he shrugged. "But eventually things go back to normal." I folded the towel carefully. "What's normal?" I asked. Daniel looked at me for a long moment. "The part where you go back where you came from." He said it so casually, as if he were explaining something obvious. I remember standing there in the quiet kitchen trying to understand whether he meant the orphanage, or simply anywhere that wasn't his father's home. Before I could respond, he grabbed a soda from the refrigerator and walked toward the hallway. "Oh," he added over his shoulder. "Don't get too comfortable." The front door opened a few minutes later. Robert had come home early that night. Daniel didn't repeat those words when his father was around. He never did. But the message stayed. And as the years passed, it appeared in different ways. Sometimes in small comments, sometimes in long silences during family dinners, and sometimes in the way Daniel introduced me to people. "This is Emily," he would say. Then after a pause, almost as an afterthought, "She lives with us. Not my sister. Not my father's daughter. Just someone who lived there." Robert noticed more than he ever said out loud. He always noticed. One evening when I was about 12, we were sitting on the back porch watching the sun go down over the trees. He had a habit of polishing his old service medals when he was thinking about something. The cloth moved slowly in his hands as he spoke. "You and Daniel see the world differently," he said. "I watched a bird land on the fence." "He doesn't like me," I said quietly. Robert stopped polishing the metal. "That's not entirely true." He leaned back in the chair. "He doesn't understand you." I thought about that for a moment. "Is that better?" Robert smiled slightly. "Understanding takes time." Then he placed the metal back in its case and looked at me. "People reveal who they are eventually, Emily." His voice was calm, almost reflective. "And when they do, the important thing isn't what they say." He tapped the case gently. "It's what they choose to do." Over the years, Daniel chose many things. He chose to keep his distance. He chose to treat me like a guest who had stayed far longer than expected. And when he married Margaret 10 years later, he chose someone who saw me the same way. Margaret had a sharp way of smiling, the kind that showed teeth but never warmth. The first time Robert introduced us, she shook my hand politely. But later that evening, when Robert stepped out of the room, she leaned slightly closer to me. "So," she said quietly, "you're the famous orphan." Her voice carried a hint of amusement. I held her gaze. "That's one way to describe it." Margaret tilted her head. "Well," she said, "it must have been quite the opportunity." Opportunity. The word lingered in the air. As if my entire life with Robert had been some sort of lucky accident. As if I had simply stepped into a life that belonged to someone else. Years passed. Robert rose through the ranks. Colonel. Then Brigadier General. And eventually, the title everyone outside our home knew him by. General Whitaker. The house grew larger. The responsibilities grew heavier. But inside those walls, one thing remained unchanged. Robert treated me like his daughter. Daniel treated me like a stranger. And Margaret treated me like a problem that would eventually solve itself. Back in the law office, decades later, I could see that same belief written across their faces. They still thought time had worked in their favor. They still believed that when Robert died, everything he built would finally return to the family they believed truly deserved it. Across the table, Daniel shifted in his chair again. Margaret leaned closer to him and whispered something that made him smile. Neither of them noticed that Mr. Caldwell had already turned to the next page. And when the lawyer finally spoke again, his voice carried a tone that made the entire room slowly fall quiet. Mr. Caldwell's voice carried calmly across the conference room. "The primary residence located on Maple Ridge Drive." Margaret straightened in her chair immediately. Daniel's fingers stopped tapping the table. Even the grandchildren looked up from their phones. Everyone in that room knew exactly which house he meant. The house Robert had brought me to when I was 8 years old. The house where I had grown up. Where every hallway carried echoes of decades of quiet family life. Mr. Caldwell continued reading. "Along with all furnishings, personal archives, and military memorabilia contained within the property." Margaret's smile slowly widened. Daniel leaned back again, confidence returning to his face. He didn't even try to hide it. They had already decided what would happen. To them, this was simply the formal confirmation. Daniel glanced toward me briefly. The same look again. That mixture of amusement and mild impatience. As if the process was just taking longer than expected. Margaret tilted her head toward him and whispered something quietly. I couldn't hear the exact words, but I caught the phrase listing agent. Daniel chuckled under his breath. Back when Robert was alive, conversations like that never happened. Not in front of him. Robert had a way of controlling a room without raising his voice. One look from him could silence a table full of officers. But now his chair was empty. And the people who had always waited politely while he spoke were suddenly in a hurry to divide everything he had built. Mr. Caldwell turned another page. The property will remain under the control of the estate until all legal procedures are completed. Margaret frowned slightly. That's standard language, Daniel muttered. The lawyer continued reading smaller items. Vehicles. A collection of antique watches Robert had gathered over the years. Several charitable donations. Margaret shifted again, clearly growing impatient. Finally she spoke. "Excuse me, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice smooth and polite. "But could we perhaps move to the main distributions?" Daniel nodded. "Yes. The larger assets." The lawyer paused briefly. Then he adjusted his glasses. "We are getting there." Margaret folded her hands on the table. Across from her I remained still. 40 years in Robert's household had taught me something very important. Patience. Robert used to say patience wasn't weakness. It was discipline. And discipline often made other people uncomfortable. Margaret glanced toward me again. This time she didn't bother lowering her voice. "Well," she said lightly, "I imagine this part must be a little awkward." Daniel smirked. I lifted my eyes slowly. "Awkward?" I asked. Margaret smiled politely. "Oh, you know," she said. "These situations can be difficult when expectations aren't realistic." The grandchildren exchanged amused looks. Daniel crossed his arms. "My father was a very generous man," he said. "But he also believed in keeping things within the family." The word family hung in the air like a quiet accusation. I nodded once. "Yes," I said calmly. "He did." Margaret leaned back again. "Exactly." Then she added with a small laugh, "So it's probably best not to assume too much." The lawyer continued reading. But now the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The confidence on Daniel's face was growing. Margaret's posture had relaxed completely. They believed the outcome was already obvious. That Robert had done what every man eventually does. Return everything to his bloodline. Daniel leaned closer. To Margaret again. "I told you," he whispered. "He wouldn't forget his own son." Margaret gave a satisfied nod. Across the table, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Just the quiet stillness Robert had always carried when he walked into a difficult situation. Because deep down, I remembered something Margaret and Daniel had clearly forgotten. Robert Whittaker never made decisions based on obligation. He made them based on character. And character was something he had spent a lifetime studying. Mr. Caldwell turned to another page. Then another. The rustle of paper echoed softly in the room. Finally he stopped. He placed both hands on the document in front of him and looked up. Daniel straightened slightly. Margaret's smile returned. "This next section," Mr. Caldwell said slowly, "contains instructions written personally by General Whittaker." Daniel nodded once, clearly expecting something sentimental. Margaret rolled her eyes slightly. Robert had always enjoyed writing long letters, even in official documents. But Mr. Caldwell's voice had changed. It carried a weight now. The kind that made people instinctively sit a little straighter. He cleared his throat. "These instructions," he continued, "are to be read exactly as written." Margaret sighed softly. Daniel looked mildly amused. But as the lawyer began reading the first line, the expression on Margaret's face began to shift. And for the first time that afternoon, Daniel stopped smiling. Mr. Caldwell adjusted his glasses once more before he began reading. His voice was steady but slower now. More deliberate. These instructions were written personally by General Robert Whittaker 3 months before his passing. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. Margaret's confident smile had faded just a little, though she quickly replaced it with another polite expression. Across the table I remained still. Mr. Caldwell continued. General Whittaker requested that this section be read exactly as written, without alteration. The lawyer paused briefly, then began reading Robert's words. "To my family," the room was quiet. "If you are hearing this, it means that I am no longer there to speak for myself." Margaret folded her arms loosely. Daniel stared down at the table. Mr. Caldwell continued. "For most of my life, I have believed that character matters more than inheritance." The lawyer's voice echoed softly in the large conference room. "A man may build wealth, property, and reputation, but the true measure of his legacy is the people he leaves behind." Daniel exhaled quietly, clearly impatient. Margaret tapped one manicured finger against the table. But Mr. Caldwell kept reading. I have spent many years observing the people around me. Some of them share my blood. Others share my values. The lawyer looked up briefly, then continued. There is a difference. Margaret frowned slightly. Daniel's eyes lifted from the table. Mr. Caldwell turned to the next page. When I first brought Emily into my home, she was 8 years old. My name hung in the air like a quiet bell. Margaret stiffened slightly. Daniel's jaw tightened. The lawyer continued reading. She arrived with nothing but a small suitcase and a stubborn refusal to feel sorry for herself. I remembered that suitcase. It had been blue. One broken zipper. And a library book I had been too afraid to return. Over the years, Robert's letter continued, I watched her grow into someone stronger than most adults I have known. Margaret shifted in her chair. Daniel glanced toward me. For the first time that afternoon, there was no amusement in his eyes. Mr. Caldwell read on. Emily learned discipline, patience, and responsibility. Not because she was born into my family, the lawyer paused briefly, but because she chose to become part of it. The room remained silent. Margaret's smile had completely disappeared now. Daniel's arms were crossed tightly over his chest. Mr. Caldwell continued. In contrast, I have also observed members of my own bloodline who believe inheritance is something they are owed. Margaret inhaled sharply. Daniel's chair creaked slightly as he leaned forward. The lawyer didn't stop. To those individuals I say this clearly. My estate is not a reward for sharing my last name. The words landed heavily in the room. Daniel finally spoke. Is this really necessary? He muttered. Mr. Caldwell didn't respond. He simply continued reading Robert's letter. Wealth without character is a burden. Property without responsibility becomes waste. And inheritance without respect destroys families. Margaret's voice cut into the room. Excuse me, she said sharply. Is there an actual distribution listed here? Mr. Caldwell raised one hand politely. There is. He turned another page. Daniel leaned back again, though the confidence in his posture was no longer as relaxed as it had been earlier. Mr. Caldwell's voice softened slightly as he continued reading. For many years, Emily has been the person I trusted most, with the management of my personal affairs. That part surprised Margaret. Her head snapped toward me. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Mr. Caldwell read on. She has handled my medical decisions, my financial accounts, and my correspondence when I was no longer able to manage them alone. Margaret looked visibly confused now. Daniel frowned. Because that part was true. In the final years of Robert's life, his health had slowly declined. Not dramatically, but enough that he needed help. Help Daniel rarely offered. Mr. Caldwell turned the page again. Robert's words continued. During that time, I had the opportunity to observe who appeared only when convenient, and who remained when things became difficult. The room had grown very still. Margaret glanced nervously toward Daniel. Daniel stared directly at the lawyer now. The smirk from earlier was completely gone. Mr. Caldwell's voice remained calm. Because of these observations, I have made certain decisions regarding the future of my estate. He paused briefly. Then he lifted the final sheet of paper. Margaret's fingers tightened against the table. Daniel leaned forward. And for the first time since the reading began, everyone in the room understood that something about this will was not unfolding the way they expected. The final sheet of paper rested in Mr. Caldwell's hands. For a moment he didn't read. He simply looked around the table. Daniel sat forward now, elbows on the polished surface, his fingers tightly laced together. The relaxed confidence he had worn earlier that afternoon was gone. Margaret's posture had changed too. Her shoulders were no longer loose. Her smile had disappeared entirely. Even the grandchildren had stopped whispering. The room had grown quiet in a different way now. Not bored. Not impatient. Careful. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat and continued reading. Regarding the primary residence located on Maple Ridge Drive. Daniel nodded once, as if this part was finally returning to familiar territory. Margaret leaned slightly toward him again. There it was again, that faint sense of relief they had been waiting for. The lawyer continued. including the house, surrounding property, and all permanent structures. Margaret's lips curved faintly. Daniel exhaled through his nose. They were already picturing the sale, the renovations, the profit. Mr. Caldwell did not rush the next line. He read it slowly. This property shall remain under the control of the Whitaker Family Trust. Daniel frowned slightly. Margaret tilted her head. Daniel spoke first. What trust? Mr. Caldwell glanced briefly at him. The Whitaker Family Trust was established by General Whitaker approximately 8 years ago. Margaret blinked. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Why wasn't that mentioned before? Mr. Caldwell calmly turned another page. Because this is the first time the trust has been activated. Margaret looked at Daniel again. Something uncertain had crept into her expression. The lawyer continued reading. The Whitaker Family Trust will oversee the management of the Maple Ridge property, along with the following assets. He listed several items. Investment accounts, 2 commercial properties in Illinois, land holdings in Montana, a portfolio of defense industry stocks Robert had accumulated over decades. As the numbers were read aloud, the grandchildren finally set their phones down. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. Daniel stopped moving entirely, because the value being described was far larger than any of them had expected. Mr. Caldwell paused only briefly before continuing. The trustee appointed to manage the Whitaker Family Trust shall be Emily Carter. My name settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water. No one spoke. Margaret blinked. Daniel stared directly at the lawyer. I'm sorry, what? Mr. Caldwell calmly repeated the sentence. The trustee appointed to manage the Whitaker Family Trust shall be Emily Carter. Daniel let out a short laugh. That's ridiculous. Margaret leaned forward quickly. There must be some mistake. Mr. Caldwell shook his head once. There is no mistake. Daniel's voice hardened. My father would never put someone else in charge of family property. The lawyer lifted the letter again. These are General Whitaker's written instructions. Margaret looked at me now. Really looked. As if seeing me for the first time. You knew about this? I shook my head slowly. No, that part was true. Robert had always been private about his legal affairs. He believed surprises revealed people's true nature. Mr. Caldwell continued reading Robert's words. Emily has demonstrated the judgment, patience, and discipline necessary to manage this estate responsibly. Daniel shook his head again. This is unbelievable. Margaret leaned closer to him. She's just the trustee, she whispered quickly. That doesn't mean she owns anything. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, that part still made sense to them. The trustee manages assets, but ownership can belong to someone else. Margaret relaxed slightly again. Daniel crossed his arms. Fine, he said. So who actually inherits the trust? Mr. Caldwell lowered the letter. Again, there is another section addressing that. Margaret exhaled. Daniel leaned back again. The confidence returned to his face, though weaker than before. Of course, this was the explanation. The legal structure. Emily manages it, but the family inherits it. Margaret even smiled faintly again. Across the table I remained still, because something in the tone of Robert's letter had already told me. This story was not going to unfold the way Daniel expected. Mr. Caldwell turned the final page. The trust's primary beneficiary, he said slowly, is also specified in General Whitaker's instructions. Margaret clasped her hands together. Daniel leaned forward again. And for the first time that afternoon, every single person in that room was waiting for the same sentence. Mr. Caldwell looked down at the page. Then he began to read. Mr. Caldwell looked down at the final page for a moment before speaking. The paper barely moved in his hands, but the room had changed completely. No one was whispering anymore. No one was checking their phones. Even the faint confidence Daniel had tried to rebuild after hearing the word trust had faded again. Margaret sat perfectly still. Her fingers were interlocked on the table, her knuckles slightly pale. Mr. Caldwell began reading. The primary beneficiary of the Whitaker Family Trust shall be Emily Carter. The sentence landed in the room with absolute clarity. For a moment no one spoke. It was as if the words needed a few seconds to travel through the air and settle into everyone's understanding. Then Daniel laughed. But it wasn't the relaxed laugh he had given earlier. This one was sharp. Short. That's absurd. Margaret turned toward the lawyer quickly. There must be a misunderstanding, she said. Mr. Caldwell didn't look surprised. He simply read the line again. The primary beneficiary of the Whitaker Family Trust shall be Emily Carter. Daniel pushed his chair back slightly. No, he said firmly. That's not possible. His voice had risen now. My father would never leave everything to someone who isn't even his real daughter. The room grew very quiet again. Mr. Caldwell lifted the letter slightly. These are General Whitaker's written instructions. Daniel shook his head, his jaw tight. This is some kind of legal technicality. I'm his son. Margaret leaned forward. Yes, she said quickly. And blood relatives always have priority in inheritance law. Mr. Caldwell remained calm. That is not the case when a will and trust are clearly established. Daniel stared at him. You're telling me my father left his entire estate to her? Mr. Caldwell lowered the letter. The trust controls the majority of General Whitaker's assets. Daniel scoffed. That's not what I asked. Mr. Caldwell met his eyes directly. Yes, he said calmly. That is what I'm telling you. The silence that followed felt heavy. Margaret turned toward Daniel slowly. You said he wouldn't do this, she whispered. Daniel didn't respond. His eyes were still fixed on the lawyer. This doesn't make sense, he muttered. Mr. Caldwell turned back to the page. There is additional clarification in General Whitaker's letter. He continued reading. I am aware that this decision may surprise certain members of my family. Margaret let out a quiet scoff. Daniel rubbed his temples. Mr. Caldwell read on. However, inheritance should not be determined by biology alone. Daniel looked up sharply. Margaret's expression hardened. The lawyer continued. Emily has spent more than 40 years in my household. During that time she demonstrated loyalty, responsibility, and patience. Daniel shook his head again. This is unbelievable. Margaret whispered something under her breath. But Mr. Caldwell continued reading Robert's words. Family is not defined by blood. It is defined by who stands beside you when life becomes difficult. The room had grown very still again. Robert's voice, through the letter, felt almost present in that moment. Mr. Caldwell turned to the next paragraph. In the final years of my life, Emily became the person I trusted with every aspect of my care. Daniel's expression darkened. Margaret glanced between the lawyer and me, because they both knew that part was true. When Robert's health had started to decline, I had been the one attending doctor appointments, managing medications, answering late-night phone calls from hospitals. Daniel had visited, occasionally, usually for short dinners. But responsibility had a way of revealing who was actually present. Mr. Caldwell continued reading. During that time, my son Daniel chose to distance himself from those responsibilities. Daniel slammed his palm lightly on the table. That's not fair. Margaret looked shocked. The lawyer didn't react. He simply continued. I do not say this with anger. But I believe inheritance should follow the path of responsibility. Margaret stared at the table. Daniel's jaw tightened again. Mr. Caldwell read the final line of the paragraph. For this reason I have entrusted the Whitaker estate to Emily Carter. Silence returned once more. But it was no longer the polite silence of a formal meeting. It was the kind of silence that appears when people realize something they assumed was guaranteed never actually belonged to them. Across the table, Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. Margaret's face had gone pale. The grandchildren looked between each other, unsure of what to say. And for the first time since the reading began, no one in that room was smiling anymore. The silence after Mr. Caldwell finished reading Robert's words stretched across the conference room like a heavy curtain. No one moved. Daniel stared at the table as if the wood grain might suddenly rearrange itself into a different answer. Margaret was the first to speak. That's not legally binding. Her voice sounded sharp now, stripped of the smooth politeness she had used earlier. Mr. Caldwell folded the letter calmly. The letter explains the intent behind the legal documents, he said. Margaret shook her head immediately. No, that's not what I mean. She leaned forward across the table. You're telling us that everything goes to her? Daniel finally spoke again. My father had multiple properties, he said. Investments, retirement accounts, stocks. His voice was controlled, but the tension underneath it was obvious. There's no way all of that just disappears into one trust. Mr. Caldwell opened another folder beside him. General Whitaker anticipated that question. Margaret blinked. Daniel frowned. The lawyer removed several documents and laid them neatly on the table. These are the trust schedules. He slid the first page slightly forward so everyone could see. Assets included in the Whitaker Family Trust. The room remained quiet as he began reading. The Maple Ridge residence. Margaret's lips parted slightly. The Montana property. Approximately 800 acres. One of the grandchildren whispered softly. 800. Mr. Caldwell continued. 2 commercial office buildings located in downtown Chicago. Daniel's eyes lifted quickly. And the Whitaker Defense Investment Portfolio. Margaret's voice came out almost as a whisper. That's impossible. Because she knew exactly what that portfolio was. Robert had built it slowly over 30 years. Defense contractors. Engineering firms. Aerospace suppliers. Stocks that had grown quietly but steadily over decades. Mr. Caldwell turned another page. The total estimated value of assets currently held by the Whitaker Family Trust, he paused briefly, is approximately $142 million. The number seemed to drain the air from the room. No one laughed this time. Margaret's face had gone completely pale. Daniel stared at the document like it was written in another language. The grandchildren stopped pretending to look uninterested. Even they understood that number. Margaret leaned closer to Daniel. You said it was maybe 15, she whispered. Daniel didn't answer. Because that's what he had believed. Robert had never talked about his finances. He had always preferred quiet investments, quiet growth, quiet planning. Mr. Caldwell continued calmly. As trustee, Emily Carter will have full authority to manage the Whitaker Family Trust, including all financial decisions regarding these assets. Margaret looked at me again. But this time there was no smug smile. Only disbelief. You expect us to believe this? Her voice trembled slightly now. Mr. Caldwell didn't react. These documents were signed, notarized, and registered 8 years ago. Daniel suddenly leaned forward. This can't stand, he said. We can challenge it. Margaret nodded quickly. Yes. Absolutely. Daniel turned directly to the lawyer. My father was elderly. Mr. Caldwell raised one eyebrow slightly. He was 81 when the trust was finalized. Daniel continued anyway. That's exactly my point. Margaret jumped in. He could have been manipulated. The room went quiet again. Slowly, Daniel and Margaret both looked toward me. The implication hung in the air. Mr. Caldwell closed the folder gently. General Whitaker anticipated that argument as well. Daniel frowned. What argument? Mr. Caldwell reached for another document. This one. He slid the paper across the table. A certified psychological evaluation conducted during the trust's creation. Daniel stared at the page. Margaret leaned closer. The lawyer explained calmly. At the time the Whitaker Family Trust was established, General Whitaker completed a full legal capacity assessment. He paused. The results confirmed that he was mentally sound and fully capable of making independent financial decisions. Margaret sat back slowly. Daniel said nothing. Because the document in front of them was clear. Robert had planned this. Carefully. Deliberately. Years in advance. Mr. Caldwell spoke again. In fact, General Whitaker left specific instructions regarding potential disputes. Daniel looked up. What instructions? The lawyer opened the final folder. Any family member who formally challenges the trust in court, he glanced briefly at the page, will automatically forfeit the limited personal distributions they were scheduled to receive. Margaret's eyes widened. Daniel froze. Mr. Caldwell continued calmly. Those assets will then be transferred directly into the trust as well. The room became very quiet again. But this silence felt different from before. Earlier, Daniel and Margaret had believed the future belonged to them. Now they were beginning to realize something far more uncomfortable. Robert Whittaker had not simply written a will. He had built a system. One designed very carefully to protect the one person he trusted most. No one spoke after Mr. Caldwell finished explaining the final clause. The words hung in the air like something heavy that had just fallen into the center of the room. Daniel stared down at the document in front of him. Margaret sat very still, her fingers pressed tightly together. A few minutes earlier, they had been discussing renovation plans for the Maple Ridge house. Now they were trying to understand how the entire estate had slipped beyond their reach. Mr. Caldwell quietly closed one of the folders. The remainder of General Whittaker's letter includes a few personal instructions, he said. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Margaret glanced at him nervously. But the lawyer continued. General Whittaker asked that this section be read as well. He unfolded the last page of Robert's letter. The paper was slightly worn along the edges, as if it had been handled many times. Mr. Caldwell began reading again. If you have reached this part of the document, then the truth of my decisions has likely become clear. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Margaret avoided looking at me. Mr. Caldwell continued. I did not make these arrangements to punish anyone. The lawyer's voice remained steady. I made them to protect the work of a lifetime. Daniel exhaled slowly. Margaret shifted slightly in her seat. Mr. Caldwell read the next paragraph. For decades I built my career on discipline and accountability. Those same principles guided the decisions I made regarding my estate. The lawyer turned the page slightly so the light from the window fell across the handwriting. Money can strengthen families, but it can also destroy them. Daniel scoffed quietly. But he didn't interrupt. Mr. Caldwell continued. In my later years, I watched carefully to see which members of my family understood that responsibility. Margaret's eyes dropped to the table. Daniel stared straight ahead. Some did. Others did not. The words landed softly, but their meaning was unmistakable. Mr. Caldwell paused for a moment before continuing. Emily did not ask for any of this. That sentence made Margaret look up sharply. Daniel's jaw tightened again. The lawyer read on. When I brought her into my home as a child, I did so because I believed every person deserves a chance to build a life. Over time she proved something far more important. Mr. Caldwell glanced briefly at me before continuing. She proved that loyalty and character cannot be inherited. Silence settled over the table again. Robert's voice felt almost present in the room. The lawyer continued reading. Emily stayed when life was simple. She stayed when life became difficult. And she stayed when many others chose distance. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Margaret kept staring down at the papers. Because they both knew exactly what Robert was referring to. The final years had not been easy. Robert's health had declined slowly. Doctor visits had become frequent. Some nights the phone rang well past midnight. But responsibility has a way of revealing who is willing to stand beside you when the situation stops being convenient. Mr. Caldwell continued. When my strength began to fade, Emily handled the responsibilities that others quietly stepped away from. The lawyer paused. Daniel's face had grown noticeably red. Margaret glanced toward him nervously. But Mr. Caldwell continued reading Robert's words. I say this without anger. But facts should be acknowledged. Daniel muttered something under his breath. The lawyer kept going. A family is not measured by who expects the inheritance. It is measured by who accepts the responsibility long before the inheritance exists. The room had grown very still again. Mr. Caldwell turned the final part of the letter toward the light. Robert's handwriting filled the page in calm, steady lines. If this decision causes disappointment, I ask only that you reflect on the choices that led here. Margaret finally spoke. This is unbelievable. Her voice sounded strained now. Daniel remained silent. Because deep down they both knew Robert had been watching for years. Mr. Caldwell finished the final paragraph. Emily understands the responsibilities that come with this estate. I trust her to protect what I spent my life building. Then he read the final sentence. And I trust her to do so with the same discipline and honor that guided my own life. The lawyer folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the folder. No one spoke for several seconds. Daniel stared at the documents in front of him. Margaret looked as though she had just realized the ground beneath her feet had shifted. Across the table, the grandchildren looked confused, uncertain how to react. Mr. Caldwell closed the final folder. That concludes the reading of General Whitaker's will and trust instructions. The room was silent again. But the atmosphere was completely different now. Earlier that afternoon, Daniel and Margaret had walked into this room expecting confirmation. Confirmation that the future belonged to them. Now they were beginning to understand something far more difficult. Robert Whitaker had spent years preparing for this exact moment, and the outcome had never been in doubt. No one moved after Mr. Caldwell finished speaking. The documents were now neatly stacked in front of him. The reading officially concluded. Yet the room felt suspended in a strange moment between disbelief and realization. Daniel was the first to break the silence. "This isn't over." His voice was lower now but sharper. Margaret looked at him quickly. Daniel leaned forward, both hands pressed flat against the table. "My father may have written those documents," he said. "But that doesn't mean this situation is acceptable." Mr. Caldwell folded his hands calmly. "Legally speaking, Mr. Whitaker, the situation is quite clear." Daniel ignored him. "This entire arrangement is unreasonable." Margaret nodded immediately. "Yes, completely unreasonable." Her voice had regained some of its edge. "Robert had a son," she continued. "A real son." The word real landed in the room like a quiet challenge. For the first time since the reading began, Daniel finally turned his attention directly toward me. "You knew about this," he said. I shook my head. No. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "That's convenient." Mr. Caldwell spoke calmly. "Mrs. Carter was not involved in the drafting of the trust." Margaret let out a short laugh. "That's what she says." I didn't respond. Robert had taught me something long ago about moments like this. When people feel the ground slipping beneath them, they often reach for someone to blame. Daniel pushed his chair back and stood up. "This can't possibly be what my father intended." Mr. Caldwell remained seated. These documents were signed in the presence of 2 legal witnesses and a notary. Daniel paced slowly across the room. "That doesn't change the fact that this entire situation is absurd." Margaret stood as well now. "We should speak to another attorney." Daniel nodded immediately. "Yes." Mr. Caldwell watched them both quietly. "You are certainly free to seek legal advice." Margaret turned toward him. "And if we challenge this trust?" The lawyer's expression remained neutral. "Then the clause General Whitaker included will take effect." Daniel stopped pacing. "What clause?" Mr. Caldwell opened the folder again and pointed to the page Daniel had already seen. "Any family member who files a legal challenge against the trust forfeits their remaining personal distributions." Margaret's confidence flickered. Daniel's jaw tightened again. "How much are we even talking about?" Mr. Caldwell turned a page. General Whitaker left several personal accounts outside the trust. He glanced down briefly. "The combined value of those distributions is approximately $6 million. Margaret inhaled sharply. The number was large enough to matter, but suddenly very small compared to what they had just lost. Daniel stared at the document. "So if we challenge the trust," Mr. Caldwell nodded slightly, "that amount would be transferred directly into the trust as well." Margaret sat back down slowly. Daniel remained standing. Because suddenly the situation had become very clear. They could fight. But fighting meant risking the last thing they still had. Daniel looked at me again. There was no anger in his eyes now. Just frustration. How did this happen? It wasn't really a question directed at me. More like something he was asking himself. Mr. Caldwell answered instead. General Whitaker planned his estate carefully. Daniel shook his head. But why? The lawyer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lifted the letter Robert had written. Your father addressed that question. Daniel hesitated. Margaret watched silently. Mr. Caldwell read one final sentence from the letter. The purpose of inheritance is not to reward expectation. The lawyer paused. It is to protect responsibility. The room fell quiet again. Daniel looked down at the documents spread across the table. 40 years of work. Properties. Investments. A legacy built over decades. And now all of it rested in the hands of the one person he had spent most of his life treating like an outsider. Margaret finally spoke again. So what happens now? Mr. Caldwell closed the folder. Now the trust enters its operational phase. Daniel looked up. What does that mean? The lawyer turned slightly toward me. It means the trustee begins managing the estate. For the first time since the reading began, every person in the room turned their eyes toward me. Mr. Caldwell continued. Miss Carter will be responsible for overseeing all trust assets. Margaret stared at me. Daniel looked tired now. Not angry. Just defeated. The grandchildren watched quietly. Because in a single afternoon, the entire structure of the family they thought they understood had shifted. Robert Whittaker had spent his life teaching discipline. But his final lesson had arrived only after he was gone. And now everyone in that room had to decide how they were going to live with it. For a long moment after Mr. Caldwell explained the next steps, no one spoke. The room felt quieter than it had all afternoon. Not the impatient quiet from earlier, when Daniel and Margaret had been waiting for their inheritance to be confirmed. This was a different kind of silence. The kind that appears when people suddenly realize the future they imagine no longer exists. Daniel slowly sat down again. The energy had drained from his posture. Margaret stared at the table as if she were still trying to locate the point where everything had gone wrong. Mr. Caldwell gathered the folders neatly and placed them back into his leather briefcase. The administrative transition will begin next week, he said calmly. Daniel looked up. What kind of transition? Mr. Caldwell glanced toward me briefly before answering. As trustee, Miss Carter will begin reviewing the trust's assets, financial structures, and management agreements. Margaret let out a short laugh. You're serious? Her voice sounded strained now. You expect her to run a portfolio worth over $100 million? Mr. Caldwell didn't react. General Whittaker anticipated that question. Margaret folded her arms. Oh really? The lawyer nodded slightly. Yes. He opened his briefcase again and removed one final folder. This contains the operational instructions General Whittaker prepared for the trustee. Daniel frowned. What instructions? Mr. Caldwell slid the folder across the table. I opened it slowly. Inside were several documents. Investment summaries. Property management reports. Legal structures for the trust. But on top of everything was a single envelope. My name was written on it in Robert's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. His handwriting had always been precise, disciplined, the same way he approached everything in life. Margaret leaned forward. What's that? Mr. Caldwell answered quietly. A personal letter from General Whittaker to the trustee. Daniel leaned back again. Well, he muttered. That would be her. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The room grew quiet again as I unfolded it. Robert's handwriting filled the page. Strong. Steady. Just like his voice had always been. I began reading silently at first. But Mr. Caldwell spoke gently. General Whittaker asked that the letter be read aloud if possible. I nodded once. Then I began reading. Emily, the letter began. For a moment my voice caught slightly. I continued. By the time you read this, I imagine the room around you will be filled with confusion. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. Margaret looked away. I continued reading Robert's words. I want you to remember something very important. The decisions I made regarding my estate were never about money. They were about responsibility. The room remained silent. Robert's words felt almost like he was standing there again. I read the next line. For many years, I watched how the people around me responded to responsibility. Daniel stared down at the table again. Margaret avoided looking in my direction. I continued. Some people step forward when things become difficult. Others step back. The sentence hung in the air. Robert had never been a man who wasted words. Every sentence carried weight. I read on. You stepped forward. Quietly. Without expectation. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Margaret shifted in her seat again. I continued reading. In the years when my health began to fail, you handled responsibilities that many people would have avoided. Doctor appointments. Legal paperwork. Long nights in hospital waiting rooms. Mr. Caldwell listened quietly. Daniel said nothing. Margaret looked uncomfortable. Because every person in that room knew those words were true. Robert's final years had not been easy, and responsibility had a way of making people reveal who they really were. I read the next line. I never believed inheritance should reward proximity. It should reward character. Daniel finally spoke again. That's easy for him to say. But his voice lacked the sharpness it had earlier. Robert's letter continued. The estate I leave behind is not simply money. It is the result of a lifetime of discipline. And discipline must be protected. I paused briefly before reading the final paragraph. Emily, you once asked me why I brought you home from the orphanage all those years ago. I remembered that conversation. It had been late. A quiet evening. Robert sitting on the back porch after dinner. His answer had been simple. But the letter continued. The truth is that I did not bring you home to help you. I brought you home because I believed you would one day help protect the things I cared about. I reached the final sentence. And after 40 years, I have never doubted that decision. The room was silent when I lowered the letter. Daniel stared at the table. Margaret looked shaken. The grandchildren sat quietly. Because for the first time that afternoon they were no longer hearing about money. They were hearing about something far more difficult to argue with. Character. No one spoke for several seconds after I finished reading Robert's letter. The paper rested quietly in my hands. Across the table, Daniel stared down at the polished wood surface as if he were still trying to process everything that had happened in the last hour. Margaret sat very still beside him. The sharp confidence she had carried into the room that afternoon had completely disappeared. Mr. Caldwell closed his briefcase slowly. Well, he said gently, that concludes General Whitaker's final instructions. The meeting was officially over. But no one stood up right away. Moments like that have a strange way of stretching. Daniel finally leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. For the first time all afternoon he looked tired. Not angry. Not defensive. Just tired. Margaret was the one who stood first. She gathered her purse quickly, her movements stiff. This whole situation is unbelievable, she muttered. But the edge in her voice was gone. Daniel didn't respond. He remained seated for another moment before finally pushing his chair back and standing. When he did, he looked at me. Not with the mocking smile he had worn earlier. Not with anger. Just with a quiet confusion that hadn't been there before. How long did you know? He asked. I shook my head. I didn't. Daniel studied my face for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. As if he believed me. Or maybe as if he simply no longer had the energy to argue. Margaret had already reached the door. Daniel, she said sharply. We need to leave. Daniel turned back toward the table one last time. His eyes moved across the documents. The trust. The assets. The entire life Robert had built. Then he looked at me again. You got everything, he said. I shook my head gently. No, he frowned slightly. That's exactly what happened. I folded Robert's letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. What I got, I said quietly, was responsibility. Daniel didn't answer. Because that part he finally understood. Margaret opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Daniel followed her out. The grandchildren trailed behind them silently. Within seconds the conference room was quiet again. Mr. Caldwell remained seated across from me. For a moment he said nothing. Then he smiled slightly. General Whitaker was a remarkable man. I nodded. Yes. The lawyer leaned back in his chair. You know, he said. He came into this office nearly a decade ago with a very clear idea of what he wanted to do. I looked at him. He told me something I've never forgotten. Mr. Caldwell paused briefly. He said most people assume inheritance is about family. The lawyer folded his hands. But he believed it was about stewardship. The word stayed with me. Stewardship. Robert had used it often. Taking care of something that matters. Protecting it for the future. Not owning it. Just guarding it. Mr. Caldwell stood and extended his hand. If you need anything during the transition process, my office will assist you. I shook his hand. Thank you. A few minutes later I stepped out of the building. The afternoon sun was still shining across the Chicago skyline. Cars moved steadily along the street below. People walked past without any idea that an entire life had just shifted inside the conference room above them. For a long moment I simply stood there. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out the small silver coin Robert had given me the day we met. I had kept it for more than 50 years. The metal was worn smooth now, but the memory was still clear. A tall man in a military coat. A quiet orphanage hallway. A simple question. Do you like books? Robert had changed my life that day. Not with money, not with promises, but with something far more powerful. He had given me a place to belong. And in the end, that was the only inheritance that truly mattered. The trust, the properties, the investments. All of it was simply the responsibility that came with the life he had built. But the real legacy Robert Whittaker left behind wasn't written in legal documents. It was written in choices. The choices people make when no one is watching. The choices that reveal who they really are. I slipped the coin back into my pocket and began walking down the sidewalk. Because Robert had always believed something very simple. Life doesn't measure us by what we inherit. It measures us by what we choose to protect. And now it was my turn to carry that responsibility forward.